I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
I remember the afternoon because nothing appeared to happen. The canal lay under a low sky, and the towpath smelt of moss and last night. My head rehearsed its petition for mercy. I walked because walking suggests reform, even when it only rearranges guilt. Across the water stood a Georgian house that had let its paint learn humility. Tall windows, eyelids of an old scholar. One on the first floor stood slightly open, as if the room behind it were shaping a word and had stopped midway. I paused on the iron bridge and listened to the grammar of Oxford, handlebars tapping stone, a gull correcting a vowel, rain thinking about its entrance. I told myself to keep moving. The doctor would be grateful, I considered without conviction, if I subtracted a measure from the daily arithmetic. Yet the open window held like a smudge in a clean margin. No figure crossed it. Back in my rooms, I opened the crossword and immediately wished I had not. The grid has a tyrant's talent for turning one truth into many wrong answers. A clue, unassuming and impertinent, waited near the bottom. Where silence reveals all, 7. I tried answers and erased them. Secrets often sit in the spaces rather than the letters, I told myself, and left the boxes unfilled. Rain began with manners. I thought of a tenor waiting for the baton and of the window again. A window does not open itself unless something else has moved. But stillness can be an alibi for the clever. I've known rooms arranged to persuade a visitor of the robustness of chance. Evening found me in the Jericho pub I pretend not to frequent. I contemplated restraint and summoned Lewis instead. There's been a death, sir, North Parade. Name of Dr. Adrian Kellam. Looks natural, though the doctor is still tidying his Latin. Natural deaths in Oxford often wear borrowed clothes, I told him, and said we would attend in the morning. Sleep came late and left early. Morning had the color of paper nobody wants. Lewis drove. The Kellam house met us with the careful gloom of a library. The niece, Eleanor, opened the door and kept her sadness neat. We did not see the body. We saw the space it had recently occupied. The study had that plausible disarray which speaks of a tidy person anxious to seem untidy. Papers sloped from the desk in a path too deliberate for gravity. A blotter showed a black crescent, as if an eclipse had lost its astronomer. The same window presented a narrow invitation to the damp air. I put my hand near the gap and felt nothing remarkable, which somehow was remarkable. Eleanor told us he had been unwell. She said it evenly, as if health were a language he had allowed to lapse. The maid found him at 8, chair crooked, lamp still warm, a bead of ink on the carpet. I asked whether anyone had called the previous evening. She paused, not long, and said no. People do not hear their own pauses. They are a music intended for the listener. On the mantelpiece rested a photograph of Kellam in the arrogance of youth, wearing a smile good at gathering disciples and opponents at the same rate. A college scarf slouched beneath the frame. Beside it lay a postcard of the Bodleian. Along the edge someone had scribbled a line of Catullus, delicately wrong by a syllable. The misquotation disturbed me more than the neatness of the death. I stood again by the open sash. Outside, the canal kept its counsel. The brass latch showed a shine where a thumb would press to persuade a stubborn mechanism. Lewis asked what I made of it. A room speaks in its adjustments, I said, and the most eloquent movement is sometimes the thing that should not have moved at all. We offered the appropriate words and left. In the car, I wrote one word in my notebook. Mute. It looked almost complete, and that is the stage at which ideas become dangerous. In Oxford, completeness is a costume frequently worn by puzzles waiting for company. Rain began again, almost politely. The house received us with the shyness of old brick. Rain had visited in the night and left its smell on the stair carpet. The banister felt like a hand that remembered too much. Eleanor Kellam opened without flourishes, as if grief, like learning, should be conducted in a quiet room. She led us along a corridor that understood creaking. He ate a little, read a little. Then the head began, she told me, eyes lowering to the place on the rail where varnish had resigned. He sat in the study to make notes. The maid is quite certain she closed the window last night, she added, and then, correcting from Latin to English, that the maid can be certain about many things. The study obliged every expectation a policeman keeps and distrusts. A chair angled 2 degrees beyond comfort, a lamp performing discretion. Papers had drifted with too much grace for an honest wind. At the center, yesterday's crossword halted in mid-sentence. Where silence reveals all. 7. The spaces waited, though someone had softened the pencil point. I went to the sash. It stood open the width of a hardback. The brass catch showed a small, clean crescent where a thumb had troubled it lately. Dust, conscientious elsewhere, had stepped back. Outside, the canal persisted in its single-minded grey. I felt for a draught and met only the neutrality of October. Lewis did his decent work with the notebook. "What time did you last see your uncle?" "After supper," Eleanor said, and the syllables behaved. "Anyone call?" "Not after 3. The phrase had the completeness of a door closed. She offered tea as if assuming refusal, which I supplied. On the mantelpiece, a metronome at rest, a little pyramid that believed in order. Beside it, Kellam in the apprenticeship of arrogance, the kind of scholar who collects disciples and their later resentments. Slipped beneath the frame, a postcard of the Bodleian with a half-line of Catullus along the margin. A syllable strayed where it should not. A scholar forgives a thief sooner than a misquotation. The doctor came with the calm that accompanies forms. Heart failure, he told us, timing between 9 and 11. He touched the lamp and nodded, as if heat still held a witness. Natural deaths in Oxford often study dramaturgy. Downstairs, the neighbour waited with a memory ironed flat. I noticed the study window open at first light, she informed us, kindly promoting my rank. Later, the maid joined us and, with the devotion of a chapel hymn, insisted she had shut it because draughts invite the devil. Their certainties ran on parallel lines, never colliding where truth might have stood. Back in the study, the ink blot on the carpet made a small moon. I lifted the crossword and read the clue again, because anything that means something only once should be distrusted, where silence reveals all. There are rooms in Oxford where silence is not absence, but a vocabulary. I wrote a word in my notebook. Mutus. Under it, I wrote motive, then closed the page as if concealment were part of the thought. Eleanor waited with a patience not designed to flatter the police. My uncle liked air and said books breathe better with a window up, she offered. It was the kind of remark that hopes to replace a fact with civility. Visitors after 3. None, she said, and the word arrived too neatly. We left with the rain undecided and the city busy with discretion. From the pavement I looked up at the open sash and imagined the room filling with a truth it did not want. Lewis asked what I was thinking. Only that a window had opened when no one moved, I said, and such things usually mean someone has arranged for stillness to do the talking. We would go to the Bodleian before the day taught us its wrong lesson. Driving away, I considered the errant syllable and how the smallest misstep in a line of verse changes the path beneath the feet. The dead are often tidy. It is the living who arrange the mess. Oxford supplies the silence in which the arrangements look like nature. They gathered with the diffidence of people who know the weight of their names. The porter at St. Radgun's lifted a ledger and found mine already written in a different hand. The quad held rain like a remembered argument. Gutters ticked, stone breathed out its long education. Professor Malcolm Steer presented himself as a man unaccustomed to apology. He spoke of Kellam in the past tense with professional ease, as one might shelve a colleague beside Augustine and be done. Laura Winscombe stood by the library window and rethreaded a hairpin with the dexterity of someone used to making small repairs while larger things failed elsewhere. Julian Hart arrived late, a damp poet with a practiced contempt for audiences. I let them talk into my notebook. Steer said Kellum had assembled them to edit a private manuscript discovered in a college cupboard whose key had gone missing in 1963 and returned with a conscience. Hart translated cupboard as tomb. Laura watched the rain choose one stone over another and admitted little. I asked about meetings and permissions, those low matters upon which grand theories bleed. The secretary produced the visitor book without fuss. 3 signatures appeared on Tuesday, Steer at 9:40, Hart at 10:21, and a neat L. Winscombe at 11:15. Kellum's hand endorsed each with a tick that enjoyed itself. Tracing the column, I saw the extension number added after the ink had dried. A different pressure. Someone wanted the record to point elsewhere. Steer walked me to the chapel as if acoustics might recommend him. He rehearsed his thoughts on the manuscript, a Christian poet of late antiquity, morally useful in vapid days. I asked whether Kellum had promised him the commentary. He allowed that the work of the many sometimes thrives under the name of one. The sentence wore robes. The feet underneath were tired. Laura took me to the reading room, a corridor that remembered creaking. She moved with the caution of someone keeping faith with doubt. Kellum had insisted on secrecy, she said, while teaching it the structure of gossip. From a folder, she produced a slip copied in her hand. The fragment concerned a window that opens when no hand moves. She looked at me as though the college itself might be listening. Hart permitted an interview by the catalogue cabinet. He had a face that would look older every time he won. Kellum, he said, had stolen from the dead and from the living with equal elegance. The Bodleian's accusation had been clumsy. Kellum's was an art. He carried a notebook whose flyleaf showed the Bodleian stamp neatly crossed out. Thieves correct one theft with another. Small things asked to be noticed. Steer's parking permit had expired last week, yet his rover sat inside the railings, immune to fines. Influence is a set of keys. On Hart's right cuff, a dark bloom had dried to the shape of a sigh. Ink always confesses to water. Laura's library card bore a crease that matched the fold on the visitor page. She had turned it back on itself while thinking. These minor loyalties to habit belonged to them more honestly than any speech. Lewis, in the porter's cubby that smelt of envelopes and tea, asked what I liked least. Their certainty, I said, and the way each loved Kellum for the chance to feel wronged. I ran a finger along the ledger again. The amended extension disturbed me. A man who enjoys ticks does not miswrite his own number. Someone had placed a call after the signing and preferred the record to hint at another. Outside, the rain recovered its patience. I stood beneath the arch and let the college drain its hour into the gullies, thinking of the line about a window, of a study arranged to look untidy, and of how scholarship so often resembles crime in everything except courage. The Bodleian has a particular smell when the rain resumes, a blend of ink and regret, perhaps the ghost of paper itself. That afternoon, the place was almost empty. A library without its murmurs is a chapel after the service. Everything. Consecrated, nothing yet forgiven. I had come because of a letter, an envelope addressed to Dr. Adrian Kellum, found unopened among the drift of his papers. Its handwriting was confident but oddly formal, as though emotion had been rewritten several times until it appeared scholarly. The quotation inside, a fragment of Catullus, carried a small lie in its meter. A single syllable too many. Only someone who loved the poet too well would err like that. I brought it to the manuscript's room. Light fell thinly through the tall windows, where rain streaked the glass into narrow distortions. Miss Talbot, the assistant librarian, recognized the hand at once. "Eleanor Kellum," she said. "The niece. She often copied classical texts for her uncle. An elegant woman, self-contained if that's not an unkind word. I told her unkindness was seldom my trade. On a side table sat a catalogue ledger open to withdrawn works. Kellam's name appeared twice beside the same title. Elegies of Propertius, 3rd edition, annotated. One copy returned, the other still marked out. The return date had been amended, ink darker than the rest. Someone had been tidying the past. Lewis stood a little apart, pretending not to breathe too loudly in that vaulted air. He asked if I thought it mattered. "Everything matters until it doesn't," I said, "and that is what makes it so exhausting." The assistant turned the pages with the reverence of one handling relics. She found a note from last spring, Kellam requesting the missing volume for private comparison. It had been signed by Laura Winscombe, the librarian who had once studied under him. Another neat circle closed in silence. I asked to see her handwriting. The permission slip bore her slanted, intelligent scrawl. No extra syllables there. We left the reading room and walked the length of Duke Humphreys, the ceiling stretching like a held breath. A young student dropped a pencil. The echo felt almost moral. I noticed the binding on the catalogue's leather spine had been rethreaded recently, the stitching too new for the age of the cover. Someone had taken a knife to the past and sewn it up again. Outside, the rain met the cloisters with a sincerity I could not match. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift upward until it became indistinguishable from the weather. Lewis asked whether the letter meant anything. "It meant someone cared enough to lie in Latin," I said, "and that is rarely an innocent act." He frowned, the way decent men do when intellect begins to sound like cruelty. Later, back at the station, I unfolded the letter once more. The paper bore the faint impression of another sheet beneath it, words pressed through by a heavy hand. I shaded the surface lightly with pencil. 2 fragments appeared like something half-remembered. Window, confessio. The latter could have meant confession or disclosure, or perhaps only the act of breathing out. I wrote them down without deciding which they preferred to be. When I left, the night had turned brittle. The streets of Oxford shimmered as though varnished by thought. In my mind, Kellam's study stood waiting, the open window unmoving, the crossword unfinished. Somewhere between Catullus and Propertius, between a niece's careful lie and a librarian's missing book, the truth had begun to hum, a faint vibration beneath the hush. I did not yet know what it was saying, but I could almost hear the rhythm. It was, I thought, the sound of a syllable misplaced, small enough to ruin the line, large enough to tell the story. The evening prepared itself the way Oxford prefers. After a day that smelled of pages left too close to a window, I went back to St. Redgun's for a recital in the chapel, because music persuades fact to stand still long enough to be seen. The porter nodded. Rain threaded the archways. The quadrangle kept its secrets the way a good librarian keeps a promise. Inside, the choir began with Purcell. I let the notes wash the week and thought of Kellam's desk, the spill of ink, the crossword with its impertinent catechism. Where silence reveals all. 7. I tried an answer without pencil. Mutism, too clinical. Mystery, too eager. I stopped. The piece ended. People clapped as if absolution could be summoned by rhythm. I stepped out during the interval and found the evening hesitant in the cloister. Stone breathed the old Latin back at me. That was when I heard them. Laura Winscombe, quiet but serrated, and Professor Steer, whose patience sounded like a courtroom. He said there was no use in resurrecting fragments that never should have left the tomb. She answered that dead languages often carry living debts. He told her destruction was mercy. She asked whose mercy he had in mind. I did not move. Sound behaves generously under vaulting. Whispers arrive as confidences. Steer claimed Kellam had ruined the project by promising credit he could not afford to pay. Laura spoke of a leaf from the manuscript that had gone missing in spring, the one Kellam had insisted on keeping in his study for comparison. She said a word almost like penultimate, then corrected herself, and I felt the correction more than the phrase. Footsteps approached, the conversation dissolved into polite weather. They passed me with the courtesy the English save for strangers and policemen. Steer gave a bow that ran on battery. Laura's eyes carried a refusal to be surprised. Lewis was waiting near the porter's desk, reading a notice about evacuation drills with undeserved seriousness. "Heart's done a flit," he told me when we were outside. Devon left a note with the bursar saying the manuscript can complete itself without him. He pronounced it like a poet reviewing fate. I asked the time of departure. Before lunch, apparently. A woman with a white terrier witnessed both suitcase and rhetoric. We walked the perimeter of the quad the way tired men walk a conclusion they distrust. On the grass, no footprints. The rain had pared the narrative down to theme. I stopped under the oriel and looked up at the traced glass. In the reflection, I saw my own face made temporarily virtuous by architecture. A thought stepped forward, tentative as a novice dawn. If the leaf had gone missing in spring, and Kellam retained it, then the line about the window that opens when no hand moves was not merely a poet's ornament. Perhaps it named method. Back in the chapel, the organ resumed its argument with air. I stood at the rear and let the sound propose an ethics. A small thing presented itself. In the visitor's book that morning, Steer's 9:40 had been written over a fainter figure. The ink insisted on being later than it pretended. And now, in the cloister, he had spoken like a man anxious to place the past in an urn and label it piety. People keen on burial usually have something noisy to hide. The ledger, the misstep in her speech, the vanished leaf. Each moved without moving me closer. When we left, the quadrangle seemed to lean closer, as if to test the quality of our silence. I thought of Kellam's window again, the brass latch polished by a thumb that hoped to look innocent, and of a line in my own notebook. Mutus. The city rang a wet bell. Lewis asked what next. "Sleep," I said, and then the book that isn't there. Lewis believed we had it then. Hart, the poet turned petty thief, the one whose melancholy arrived already edited for publication. His departure for Devon looked obliging. Guilt likes the sea. We found him in a guest house above a harbour that smelt of salt and disinfectant. He answered the door wearing an expression rehearsed for sympathy and failure. He told us he'd loved Kellam once, by which he meant he'd needed his approval. The betrayal, he said, had been academic, not mortal. He drank as he spoke, small measured sips as if truth were whiskey and best rationed. I asked when he'd last seen Kellam. He said Tuesday, though the maid swore none had visited. He smiled. Maids, he said, see what they are told to. The smile felt borrowed from someone cleverer. I let him talk, because talk always frays at the edge. He described the lost manuscript, his own lines woven among Kellam's commentaries, a collaboration turned theft. He said he had gone that night to demand restoration of authorship, but the courage left him halfway along Banbury Road. He turned instead into a pub, where, by his account, he recited Latin to the wallpaper and wept for civilization. Lewis confirmed a witness remembered the recital, though not the remorse. Driving back, Lewis allowed himself the satisfaction of verdict. Motive, opportunity, flight. You've the hat trick, sir. I said nothing. Some solutions arrive too obediently. They answer every question but the one you asked. The next morning I sat with the file again. The photographs of the study, each one unremarkable until you stare long enough. The glass of wine beside the chair, half drunk, half waiting. The ink blot, now the size of a wound. The crossword unfinished except for one clue. where silence reveals all. 7. Hart had used silence well in his confession. He'd left no trace, no fresh word. I wrote possible answers on a scrap of paper. Mutism, candor, absence, reticence. None sounded like murder. Later, in the college archive, I asked the clerk to bring me the visitor log again. Hart's signature, bold and carelessly romantic, sprawled across the page. Next to it, Kellam's confirming tick, except this one had been made in a different ink. Slightly browner, more deliberate. A correction after the fact, perhaps to ensure completeness. Scholars like their records neat, even posthumously. That night, I opened my notebook to the page marked Mutus. Beneath it, I added motive and method, and then, almost without meaning to, mirror, a single word that changed the shape of the others. The phone rang near midnight. Lewis again. He'd found a second witness in Devon, a chambermaid who'd seen Hart on the pier after midnight, reading aloud to no one. He'd dropped his notebook into the sea when she approached, as if ceremony were part of the guilt. The story fit too neatly. The world rarely rehearses its tragedies that well. I told Lewis to sleep. We'd speak in the morning. After hanging up, I poured a measure of whiskey and watched the city's lights flicker through the rain. Oxford never sleeps. It studies. Somewhere, a student was quoting Propertius without understanding that love poems are just coded crimes. I thought again of Hart's words. Kellam had stolen from the dead. Perhaps he had. But death is a poor debtor, and Kellam had been too vain to borrow quietly. Hart's confession satisfied every ordinary mind, and that made me restless. When the clock struck 2, I understood what disturbed me. The postcard with the misquoted Catullus found on the desk. The error had been intimate, not scholarly. Hart, for all his pretensions, would never have miscounted a meter. The hand that wrote it knew Latin as love, not literature. The false solution had folded itself neatly and waited for applause. I put down the glass, reached for the letter again, and saw, at last, that its grief had a woman's patience. Eleanor came late, as if time had been asked to wait at the railings. She carried a flat envelope against her chest. She said she had found something in a drawer her uncle never used for anything as common as money. I prepared myself for the usual relic and received something worse, a photograph. Kellam in a summer suit, younger, his mouth arranged into that courteous vanity scholars learn from prize committees. Beside him stood a girl with a book under her arm and sunlight where most women kept caution. Laura Winscombe, before the library, reclaimed her. In the background, a college wall attempted eternity. "Turn it," Eleanor said in the tone of someone who has already done so too often. I obeyed. On the back, in Kellam's hand, with unrepentant flourish, a line. "The past, like ink, does not fade when spilt." True and theatrical. Below the line a date, 20 years ago. I asked how it had come to her. She said the drawer had stuck and then relented, like a conscience with arthritis. She thought the photograph proved what everyone had stopped saying. That Laura had once been the promising future, and then the future had noticed someone else. The words cost her little. The pause before them paid. When she left, I set the picture on my desk and stared until the room looked back. Love, scholarship, vanity, the trinity that blesses most Oxford tragedies. I took out the torn crossword from Kellam's study, the fragment I had reconstructed. The down clues still sulked, where silence reveals all. 7. The letters I had. M. T. U.S. Chance sometimes plays detective when given a pencil. I fetched a lamp and held the photograph at an angle. The surface gave up scratches that had tried to be private. 2 scores across the margin near Laura's shoulder. Not damage from time, but a deliberate erasure, as if a hand had tried to rub her out and had stopped at the threshold of decency. On Kellam's sleeve, a faint grey bloom, no bigger than a comma, where ink had settled and dried. The past, like ink. He had not written the line absent-mindedly. He had smudged it into fact. The catalogue returned to me with the petulance of an unanswered letter, the missing propertius, the amended date, Laura's neat signature on a permission slip that had not forgiven anything, a fragment concerning a window that opens when no hand moves. I placed the photograph beside the slip until their edges agreed to argue. Lovers and leaves both go missing in spring. Later, I walked to the canal to think where the air remembers better. A cyclist hissed by. The towpath smelt of wet bark and promises downgraded to plans. I took the crossword from my pocket and wrote the letters again, this time without hoping for elegance. Mutus. Not a word a man coughs up by accident. Silence had not merely revealed. It had been chosen. Back at my rooms, the telephone refused to ring. I poured a whiskey and faced the photograph as if it had volunteered for cross-examination. Kellam's gaze obeyed the pomp of confidence. Laura's eyes did something lonelier. They forgave late and incompletely. I turned the card once more. The date placed it during a summer when Eleanor would have been practicing elegiacs, not grief. Some families inherit syntax and call it love. I slid the picture into a folder with the letter that misquoted Catullus. The two disliked each other on sight. One loved meter, the other performance. Somewhere between them waited the line that does not forgive. I wrote a word beneath my notes and underlined it until the paper bruised. Motive. Then I crossed it out because photographs and poems do not confess, and Oxford prefers its answers to arrive softly, like rain finding old stone in their time. The solicitor's office had the warmth of something embalmed. Thick curtains, heavier even than the air, and the faint musk of folders that had forgotten what sunlight was for. The man behind the desk wore his discretion like a medal. Every sentence he offered had first been sanded of personality. He produced the will without ceremony, as though unveiling something disappointingly predictable. Kellam's bequest was short and sharp. The house, the accounts, the collection of annotated texts, all left to his niece, Eleanor. Laura Winscombe's name appeared only once, buried among the list of books to be returned to the Bodleian, as if Kellam had hoped bureaucracy might suffice as consolation. The solicitor added that the will had been revised 3 weeks before the death. He said the phrase revised as though reading it from an etiquette manual. Outside, the drizzle had resumed its campaign of persuasion. I watched the solicitor's building retreat behind the windscreen and wondered what prompts a dying man to tidy his affections. Lewis drove in silence until the light changed at St. Giles. He said she'll have a motive now, then looked apologetic for having said it aloud. Motive is a poor substitute for truth, I told him, but the word has its uses. We went to see Laura. She met us in a reading room empty except for the smell of chalk and age. The desk lamp cut her face into deliberation and regret. When I mentioned the will, she smiled without warmth. He liked revisions, she said, in literature, in loyalty, in women. She denied seeing him that night, the denial, smooth, practiced, too, even for chance. A whisper reached us then, faint as breathing through stone. The college clock had chimed 3:30, and yet in that pause between bells, I thought I heard her say his name, not as an invocation, but as a verdict. I pretended not to notice. On the walk back, I recalled the small ink mark on the carpet in Kellam's study. An elliptical smudge that had seemed random. It had been directly beneath the shelf where his files on estate matters sat in military formation. If a man revised his will, he would have written drafts. A scholar's instinct is to preserve every version, even the false ones. Lewis stopped for cigarettes at a kiosk near Broad Street. I waited by the Bodleian railings, the iron cold under my hand. The rain was lighter now, the city rinsed to its essentials. From somewhere behind the Radcliffe camera came the echo of footsteps, followed by the faint sound of someone calling a name. Just a syllable. shapeless in the distance. It might have been Kellam's, or it might have been mine. That evening I returned to the house. The study had been restored to order by a mind unfamiliar with chaos. The maid had left the desk polished, the papers aligned, the air less sure of itself. I found the folder easily. Inside, among the bank statements and correspondence, lay an envelope unsealed but folded flat, as if considered and then abandoned. The handwriting was Eleanor's. I recognized the precise Latinized curves, the careful modesty of the script. The letter began as filial duty, gratitude for guardianship, concern for his health, but turned without warning to reproach. There was mention of Laura, of deception, of forgiveness too long postponed. The last line read simply, "You once said we write our own endings, but some of us only copy yours." I replaced the letter and stood a while, listening to the window tapping faintly against its frame. Somewhere a clock struck 9, the sound soft enough to be mistaken for memory. I tried the crossword clue again in my mind. Where silence reveals all, 7. The answer would not come, though the shape of it hovered near confession. When I left, the door resisted closing as though the house itself had grown accustomed to being watched. I walked back through the quadrangle, where wet stone and lamplight conspired toward melancholy. The whispering name followed me part of the way, unclaimable, undecided, until the night finally folded around it. The call woke me with the insistence reserved for bad news. Lewis said there had been another tragedy at St. Radegund's. He used the word tragedy the way Oxford prefers to speak of preventable things. I dressed with the concentration one gives to a poor clue and crossed a city that still smelt of last night's rain. Professor Malcolm Steer lay in his rooms with the neatness of a man staging his own epitaph. The porter had opened the door at 8 when Steer failed to appear for chapel. The curtains were half drawn, the organ from morning practice slipped through in wavering threads. On the desk rested a glass with the crimson honesty of wine and, beside it, a page bearing a line of Catullus. The meter was perfect this time. The corridor outside his room smelt of polish and yesterday's rain, and the porter whispered that Steer had been cheerful at supper, yet distant, as if rehearsing absence. It felt carefully arranged. Lewis recited the facts. Door locked, no sign of struggle, bottle from his private rack, letter to no one explaining nothing. I looked at Steer's right hand. A faint crescent of ink stained the cuticle, old enough to be habitual, new enough to be relevant. He had handled something recently that wished to be remembered. I walked to the window and lifted the sash an inch. Cold air entered like an auditor. On the sill, a dust line curved around the latch. Steer had opened the window earlier and closed it again, or someone had done so for him. A suicide who worries about dust is a novelty, even here. The Catullus page invited inspection. The ink blot at the end of the final word was not an accident. It turned the terminal vowel into a dot, a full stop with theatrics. The porter produced the visitor's book out of habit. Steer's name appeared for yesterday afternoon, entered at 3:12. Beneath it, a second hand had added a telephone extension in a darker ink. The same later hand I had seen beside Hart's signature. Completeness, after the fact. Somebody's hobby. Lewis thought it simple. Public scorn, private guilt, an old man meeting his limits. He asked whether I believed it. Belief is an amateur's comfort, I told him, and stepped into the small bedroom. On the table lay a program from the recital 2 nights earlier, folded with domestic exactness. Between the leaves, a petal, flattened to silence. Steer had kept souvenirs. I asked for the key to Steer's desk and received it with the reluctance colleges reserve for sunlight. The top drawer yielded a photograph of Kellam from the same summer Eleanor had shown me. But this copy lacked Laura. A white rectangle remained where a figure had been cut away, the past tidied with scissors. In the second drawer, I found the inevitable letters. One in Laura's hand, brief and restrained. She declined further meetings regarding the manuscript and wished him good sense. Another unsigned note asked that the fragment be destroyed before more harm came of it. Across the margin, in Steer's neat Latin, he had written a single imperative: Tace. When the doctor left, I poured the wine carefully into the sink. The stain along the glass clung in a ring too high for a single careful swallow. Someone had filled, sipped, set down, and arranged the remainder for effect. A suicide trying to persuade me of his elegance. We drove away through drizzle that had forgotten it began as weather. Lewis asked what had changed. Only the order of operations, I said. 2 men and a window, one open, one almost. A poem quoted twice, once poorly, once impeccably. A petal in a program, and dust that refuses to lie. We had been invited to applaud the arrangement. I preferred for the moment to listen to the quiet behind it. The city had grown still again, that special kind of Oxford stillness that is not silence but rehearsal. Somewhere in the distance a bell rehearsed its hour. Somewhere closer a curtain breathed against glass. I sat at my desk and read the crossword clue one final time, where silence reveals all. 7. The unfinished puzzle lay before me like a patient refusing confession. It was late enough that the whiskey had turned companionable. I lifted the glass and watched the lamplight make promises it could not keep. The word came without effort now. Mutus. Not simply mute, but shared, reciprocal. Silence not as emptiness, but as dialogue withheld between two who understand too well. I thought of Kellam, of Eleanor, of the window that had opened when no one moved. I returned to the study once more that night, unable to let it rest. The house was quieter than before, as though it too had surrendered to explanation. The air had the faint medicinal tang of dust and extinguished ink. On the desk, the ink blot remained, but now I saw what I had not before, the faint shimmer of something written beneath it. A scholar's hand, used to correction fluid, to layers of intention. I held the page under the lamp, tilted it slightly, and the surface changed its mind. Words surfaced, pale as breath on glass. Forgive me, El. The line trembled between contrition and irony. Forgive me, El. Forgive me, Eleanor. Or forgive me, Elegy. The scholar in Kellam would have liked the double life of that phrase. But the letter's slope told a different story. I fetched a magnifying glass and studied the ink. It was bluer, younger, written after the rest. His hand had already been shaking. Lewis arrived half an hour later, summoned without understanding why. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, wet from drizzle, asking if it couldn't wait until morning. I told him it couldn't. The light caught the edge of the page as I turned it, revealing the residue of an erased line beneath the confession, one that Kellam had written and crossed through so violently it had torn the paper's skin. Only fragments survived. The draft was meant for... The rest disintegrated. Lewis frowned and said it looked like a suicide note. But the dosage had not been wrong by chance, I said. He asked who would want him dead. I didn't answer. The truth had already chosen its own vocabulary. I walked to the window. It stood half open again, though I had closed it before. Rain slid down the pane like deliberate handwriting. On the sill, I found a thumbprint pressed faintly into the dust. A delicate, unhurried print, the kind one leaves not in panic but farewell. I compared it to the glass on Kellam's desk. The curvature matched. Someone had lingered after death had entered the room. Lewis followed my gaze. He asked quietly if I thought it was her. I said nothing, which is often the nearest I come to belief. He turned to leave, hesitated, then said he would file it as suicide. For now. His footsteps faded down the corridor. The house listened. I sat a long time with the paper in front of me. Eleanor had spoken of justice once, in that unflinching way the intelligent do when they've already made peace with guilt. She had seen the hypocrisy in Kellam's letters, the way he wrote tenderness in one hand and cruelty in the other. Perhaps she had decided to translate his remorse for him. The poison would have been simple, the symbolism irresistible, a scholar's death staged as scholarship. I folded the page carefully and replaced it in the file. Outside, the rain had gentled to mist. In the glass I saw my own reflection, dim and distorted, another man at another window, waiting for the air to clear. I thought of the line, "Forgive me, Elle," and of how forgiveness and confession are only different tenses of the same silence. When I left the house, dawn was considering its entrance. The first birds had begun their cautious rehearsal. I paused at the gate and looked back. The window on the upper floor was still open, unmoving, a square of darkness framed in the softest light. I could almost believe someone stood there, listening. Then the rain returned, and the shape dissolved into morning. I asked Lewis to wait at the corner where North Parade meets the memory of rain. We had telephoned ahead and received silence, often the most punctual reply. The house looks smaller when one knows what it contains. A sparrow rehearsed its note on the gutter. The morning smelt of soap and paper. Eleanor opened before I could knock. She had dressed for a conversation that would not raise its voice. She led me into the study that had learned to empty itself. I noticed how she did not look at the window. Some people understand that guilt is a direction, not a feeling. I told her we had read the page again, the one beneath the blot. "Forgive me, Elle." She said a scholar's last words should not be judged by handwriting. I said they rarely are, only by habit. The wine, the opened sash, the letter revised but not sent. Each appeared tidy enough to pass for accident. Tidy things, however, seldom arrive uninvited. She asked whether the police required a confession. "Not a confession," I said. "A translation, the kind a niece gives when the dead cannot finish their line." She stood very still. The clock on the mantel forgot how to tick. I walked to the desk and touched the lamp. Heat barely lingered, the ghost of industry. Beneath the blotter lay the envelope I had replaced. Inside, her careful script paused over the word mercy, then crossed it out and wrote justice. People who cross out mercy rarely stop once. Lewis came to the door and waited, a civility I've never deserved. I asked him for the evidence bag and took from it the glass we had spared from the sink. The ridge of residue at the rim stood too high for solitude. "You poured twice," I said. "You waited for his apology to become chemical." She closed her eyes, and the ash of resolve deepened. "There is cruelty in explanation," she said. "He told me Laura had been a mistake and then invited her back for one more discussion. He called it collegial. Words do not become kind because they are spelled properly." "The window," she said, "needed air." I told her the window needed an alibi. I asked about the thumbprint on the sill. She said she had leaned there as one leans at the end of a letter. I believed her. Sorrow has its furniture. She added the poison had been measured for speed and she had prayed the mathematics be merciful. The prayer reached neither God nor chemistry. Lewis took a careful step forward. "Eleanor," he began, his voice adding the courtesy he wishes the world deserved. She nodded as if we had offered at last the only kindness available, to stop asking her to improve her answers. On the way out, she asked for a minute with the bookcase. She removed a slim propertius and slid a page from its sleeve, a photocopy of the fragment about the window that opens without a hand. "I kept it," she said, "because he stole everything else." I thought of the photograph with the rubbed margin, of Steer's copy with Laura cut away, of the ledger entries improved by later ink. Oxford tidies its sins. She had simply chosen a tidier. At the door, she paused. She asked whether I believed in forgiveness. I told her belief has nothing to do with it. We forgive because memory insists on rehearsing the alternative. Lewis and I walked her to the car. The sparrow tried its note again and achieved it. Back at the station, paperwork began its ancient chant. I wrote her name too carefully, then stopped. Outside, the sky stood undecided. I thought of the crossword, where silence reveals all, and of a word that means not absence, but a pact. The window was open still, somewhere, and the room behind it would take time to breathe out. It rained that night as if the city were rehearsing itself, a soft, unending repetition of what it already knew by heart. Oxford has never needed absolution, only weather to remind it that nothing stays clean for long. I walked home by the canal, my coat darker than the water. The investigation had ended, officially, but endings in Oxford are academic things, tidy in their phrasing, untidy in their truth. At the station earlier, Eleanor had signed her statement without looking up. The pen left a faint curve at the bottom of her name, the gesture of someone closing not a document, but a life. Lewis had offered tea. She had declined. When they took her away, she didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't even shiver. I watched her pass under the archway, and for a moment I thought of the word mutuous again, not silence, but shared silence. There are crimes, I've learned, that take two people to complete and two silences to endure. Back in my rooms, the air carried the scent of old paper and surrender. I poured a whiskey, not for comfort, but out of superstition. On the table lay the crossword I'd begun days before, the one that had started this quiet unraveling. I filled in the last empty space. Mutuous. 7 letters that had outlasted a man's life and a woman's courage. A small victory for symmetry, perhaps, though not for justice. I remembered Kellam's study, the faint stain of ink, the open window, the glass half drunk and waiting. Everything about the scene had spoken of arrangement, yet what struck me most was its stillness, the utter lack of struggle. Death had come gently, like an accepted footnote. Eleanor had opened the window afterward, she said, to give him air. I believed her. People who love the dead always imagine they can still be saved from suffocation. Lewis telephoned once more before turning in. He said he couldn't quite reconcile her calm with her crime. I told him reconciliation was the one thing Oxford never taught well. We both laughed quietly, the way men laugh when they want to forget they've been moved. After he rang off, I stood by the window and watched the rain pool on the glass, distorting the lights from the opposite college. In one of those rooms, a student was likely reading Latin by lamplight, untangling declensions without knowing that elsewhere in the city,
and
a
I solved
translation
mystery.
of
Welcome
guilt
to my
had
new
been
case.
perfected. There are nights when I almost envy them, the ones who can love language without fearing what it can conceal. Kellam had loved Latin because it allowed him to say what he meant while meaning something else entirely. Eleanor, perhaps, had merely learned the habit too well. Between them they had composed a tragedy that would have made Propertius blush. I poured another measure and listened to the faint ticking of the clock. Time, I thought, has its own syntax. It pauses, it elides, it forgets conjunctions. Somewhere in that rhythm lies the truth, though never the comfort. I thought again of Eleanor's final words before they took her, something half-whispered, half-quoted. "Love and justice are both translations," she said. "You never get the grammar quite right." Outside, the rain eased to drizzle. The spire of St. Mary's vanished into a pale mist, and the lamps along Broad Street trembled like uncertain thoughts. I finished my drink and closed the notebook that bore her name. Some cases are not solved. They simply stop echoing. When I finally turned out the light, Oxford lay in that exquisite half-silence it keeps for endings, the still air that follows understanding, or what passes for it. And in that silence, before sleep, I imagined the sound of a single window opening somewhere across the city. Not in confession, not in guilt, simply to let the room breathe again.